there is sometimes this disconnect between what people in the EXCO are being told, to be quite honest, and leaders who sometimes haven't the spine to be able to stand for their team.
It's a lack of trust at institutional level that breeds through to organizational level, and a lack of trust. I mean that makes or trust will make or break a system.
Welcome to Inspired Conversations, an inspired leadership podcast where we have honest conversations about life and leadership. This is a space where we explore leadership as it is lived, not just as it is taught. Each conversation steps beyond theory to examine the realities leaders face and to reflect honestly on the state of leadership in our society. We look at the decisions, the pressures, and the responsibility that comes with influence. In short, we explore the practice of leadership and the real, sometimes messy, and often paradoxical ways it shows up in our day-to-day lives. I'm Tendai Chitapi, your host. Let's get into today's conversation. My guest today is Melissa Hall, who is currently serving as the executive head of people at Confluent. Her career spans more than 30 years across financial services, strategic human capital management, and leadership development. Much of her work has focused on building leadership capability and strengthening leadership benches, particularly during periods of organizational growth, ensuring that leadership capacity scales sustainably without burning people out in the process. Her work strongly centers on aligning people strategy with broader business strategy while building high-performing, engaged teams and cultures. Melissa, welcome to Inspired Conversations.
Good morning, and thank you, Tenda. Thank you for that introduction. The profile says it all. However, it's not always perfect. There's lots of imperfection on trying to build this, lots of imperfection on becoming that leader, and it does become quite messy.
Awesome, thank you, and thank you for availing yourself today. So there's growing recognition that leadership is not just a people issue. It's increasingly becoming a strategic issue tied to culture, retention, performance, and organizational sustainability. Yet, despite the investment many organizations make into leadership development, many still struggle to build healthy leadership pipelines and cultures that people genuinely want to stay in. Why do you think that gap still exists?
Tina, if you think traditionally leaders were chosen because you were a high performer or you seem to have the potential and capability in your current role, right? And leaders were chosen based on that. Then you get sent on a course and off you go into a classroom, or it's a series of workshops and you've got to come back into the practical environment where you have to lead. And the gap is that you cannot teach behavior in a classroom. You can teach, you can show them what the skills should look like, but you cannot apply it in the classroom. So when you don't work on the environment in which that leader goes back into, there'll still be that gap.
Yeah, that's so true. We often are reflecting and understanding that, if you teach models, frameworks, acronyms in a learning environment, I always talk about you can't send people to a 2-day leadership workshop with Muffins and expect them to come back and be leaders if the system hasn't fundamentally shifted to accommodate that shift, and hence the systemic nature of it. So at Confluent, leadership seems to be treated as something deeply connected to organizational performance and sustainability, and not just sort of an HR admin exercise. As you reflect on your own journey and story, and given the work you do now, when did leadership become strategic for you personally?
So, as you grow into, let's talk about the young leader. As you start your leadership journey, you don't know what you don't know. Leadership is a title at that point until reality hits and it becomes real, and you have to make decisions, and you've got to separate yourself from the people that used to work with you, alongside with you, and put yourself into that leadership role and start making decisions. So that for me, it's still practical, it's still tactical leadership. When it becomes strategic is when you start thinking about how what you lead on turns or impacts business strategy and business goals directly. So especially in the HR field, I mean, if we talk about the HR field, traditionally HR was an admin hub. They didn't have a seat at the table. We no longer talk about that. They have a seat at the table, but when um, when in the HR role, I mean, every leader is a human resource leader, really. When you start thinking about your actions impacting strategy and impacting the in business goal, that's when you start looking at yourself as a strategic leader and no longer a tactical leader.
You know, I've seen that this shift from HR being admin to really the necessity for the people leaders to have the strategic influence that they, I think, are slowly and increasingly, that recognition is coming that human capital needs strategic grounding.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely. Yeah.
and yeah, I think, some say that COVID had a lot to do with that, because we were forced to examine cultures, work, performance metrics and measurement and productivity and burnout. I mean, I think it was the first time that a lot of businesses really were confronted that actually it's not just headcount; you're actually dealing with
Yes.
people.
Yes.
What was your perspective around that?
Yes, absolutely. So, then it was no longer the operational HR. It was no longer hiring and firing and putting policies in place. It was now looking at those policies and making sure that it doesn't just work for the business, it works for the people. It's looking at your EVP and saying, is what do we do impacting everybody's daily experience? Because that's your EVP, right? So, I mean, COVID is a
For the
great
benefit of
example.
those who might not understand EVP.
Hmm. Your employer value proposition. So it's your
Okay.
promise to people. So, your promise to people is not just words on your website or on a wall. It's the daily lived experience of people. And if people are not having a great experience, that's when you know that your EVP isn't working.
Yeah.
So COVID is a great example. I mean, it seemed like it happened many, many moons ago, but it was the turning point for many organizations because at that point, mental health really, it was emphasized, it was highlighted. And that's where companies realize that they're not just working with headcount, we're working with people, and people matter, and people, there was an old saying, when you come to the office, you leave your personal self at home. But that's where many, even C-suite leaders, realized you come to work as a whole person, you cannot leave half of it at home. and
Yeah.
and that's where the HR role became very important, because they were the balance between performance and people management.
Absolutely. And we'll talk a little bit about how you strike that balance at Confluent. But before we go there, I'd like to look at why leadership development often fails. I mean, given the context that we've painted around the
Mm-hmm.
necessity to invest in people, Because what we
Yeah.
find is many organizations do invest quite heavily into leadership development programs, but
Mm-hmm.
still struggle with retention, trust, accountability,
Yeah.
and strong, solid leadership pipeline sort of issues. Where do you think organizations are getting leadership development wrong?
Leadership development. We look at episodic leadership development. So it's a once-off, or something happens in the system, and suddenly we think of, okay, let's send them on a course, and then we look at the system itself. So you can invest millions of rand into leadership development, but if you don't look at leadership as a system, it's not going to work. And when I talk about a system, is you give leaders the framework, and when they come back into the environment, the system includes culture, it includes how we measure leadership practices, it includes leader behavior, and it's, for leadership, many people think the main point is driving performance. Performance is only one of it, and if you don't have all four of that, it will fail, because people will come back from that workshop, from that expensive academic course, or from, the even if it's self-led learning, they will come back into an environment that they don't know how to apply those skills that they have learned.
Yeah.
And that is where leadership development goes wrong. You need to look at it as a system. You need to look at it as a whole, so holistic leadership, where leaders learn how to behave, how to be self-aware, how to coach on performance, and when to use punitive measures when it is really needed.
Yeah, you've touched on something there, speaking about, the self-awareness and emotional intelligence, because I think what we see is that, and the question I sometimes ask is, are we developing competencies but neglecting character? Because I think a large part of leadership is around maturity, so that even if you teach the frameworks and the models and the tools, but if a person's own development, level lags behind the kind of training that you are exposing them to,
Yes.
invariably there is a systemic issue that arises there.
Mm-hmm.
You've also spoken about culture and trying, I think, to solve culture issues with training interventions. And it feels like that is the tension that many organizations are having to grapple with when they can admit that
Mm-hmm.
such a gap exists,
Yeah.
which sometimes is its own issue, getting leaders to admit that something is wrong.
Yes.
So, with that sort of being said, I mean, I want to explore the idea of, as I was looking into Confluent and some of your leadership approach, that there's a very strong emphasis on data. And I think the question that I have is sort of around managing and balancing data versus humanity. You operate in an environment that's obviously very technical, but that appears to be highly data driven and metrics driven.
Mm-hmm.
How do you balance data measurement, performance pressure, if I can call it that, with
Mm-hmm.
maintaining a genuinely human leadership culture?
So we've got different touch points, and we don't just measure the leader. We do take into account input from the people that are being led, because often often we get our true measurement from those people. So at Confluent, the different measurement points. Firstly, there's leadership development, which leadership development should happen at different stages. There's your early leaders, your first time leaders. There's your more matured leaders, but forgot about the people aspect, and now just driving performance. And I also don't believe in a one size fits all leadership program. It should be about where the business is at and what the need is at the time. And as an example, depending on what the data is showing us, let's talk about. as an example, high absence. I mean, high absence could be for a number of reasons, and often people behave based on their lived experiences day to day, right? So what we then implemented was a people risk course or workshop where they have to identify, I mean, what does high absence mean? How do you deal with it? It's not something that you go in with a punitive approach. It is understanding why it is happening. So the leadership development is based around the need and not an off the shelf one size fits all. So that's number one. Then, secondly, there needs to be a certain leader behavior. So, at Confluent, as part of our promise to people, we also need to measure whether our leaders deliver on that promise. And how do we see that? We see that through surveys, we see that through exit interviews, we see that through our retention data, attrition, and we also see it through internal mobility, right? So, excuse me. So, when we look at surveys, we implement 360 surveys, and that is done twice a year, where a leader is rated based on leader behavior, leadership practices, and they are rated by their peers, by their managers, and by the direct reports, right? So, those, because it's anonymous and it really works at Confluent, is any leader with low 360 scores shows that they are not delivering on that promise for the daily lived experience of their people, because their people are saying this isn't happening. Then, so that is not just data, it's what you do with that data. If you don't do anything with that data, then that's just a survey.
Absolutely.
So we then apply some interventions, and again, it's not one size fits all. There could be a workshop to help them understand what these questions mean and what it means in practice. Um, how do you go into your team and improve your leadership practices by giving them context around why we ask these questions and what this means for the lived experience, right? There are different leadership interventions, and then there's a measurement the next time around to see if it has improved. And we've had instances where it has improved dramatically. So our benchmark is sort of 80%. We've seen instances where it improved from below 70% to over 80%. But we've also seen instances where this is just not working. And it's a matter of asking the leader to step down and supporting the leader in stepping down as well.
Yeah, I think again, there's an assumption that we can all be good at everything, but leadership, like any skill, has to be learned, and sometimes you're good at it, and sometimes not so good at it.
Yeah.
And then we can move away from this idea of positional authority and positional leadership, especially where, because that's often what we find, right, is where someone has positional authority, but lacks that leadership development internally, that they then defer to the "I told you so"
Absolutely.
because I said so,
Yeah.
which creates its own cultural and lived experience issue, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe just a final reflection on this would be what can data reveal about leadership, and what can it never really fully capture?
So, I mean, it can reveal where it breaks down in levels of leadership. It can reveal the type of leader and the leadership style, which is not working for people or doesn't work for your promise. Um, Sometimes what it doesn't reveal is what the leader's hiding, because the leader can be warm towards people, right? And it could mean that they get away with a lot of other things. And the 360 survey, for instance, will give that leader very high scores. But what it doesn't show is what's actually happening in that environment. So therefore, it is important to have different inputs, and it's important to hear from the people directly. So your data is in the form of surveys, yes. It could also be in the form of measured KPAs. But if you don't take the time to listen to people, you're not going to get the full picture.
That's true. And I think, again, when we think about organizations that scale rapidly, a lot of these gaps really reveal themselves where whatever issues leaders might be facing, I work also in the sort of men's mental health space and stuff that people might be carrying that is
Yes.
not always coming to the surface.
Yeah.
And sometimes it then emerges in ways that are sometimes quite destructive to teams.
Absolutely.
And so, on that sort of note, I want to talk about, scaling organizations. And we find that they often outgrow their leadership capability faster than they realize. And so, what are some of the early warning signs that a leadership pipeline is under strain?
So when we look at leadership pipeline, it is not just the top performer. It is the person that has the ability to take over when your leader suddenly doesn't rock up on that day. And what we can see especially in our business today, is what we can see is that when somebody doesn't have the autonomy, once a leader is there and they cannot once a leader's not there, sorry, and they cannot make decisions, it tells us there's a risk there. If teams are unable to move forward without relying on a leader, there's definitely a risk, because your pipeline that you're building shouldn't be far down. It should be somebody that can step in the moment you step out.
Absolutely.
So the early signs is the bottleneck, because teams can't make decision. It is also the clear signs would be if there is one particular leader that takes the lead and there isn't another voice in the room. Something's broken in that system.
Yeah.
It does mean that you've got leaders that are just followers and that cannot make decisions on their own. And that I've definitely seen in the workplace.
Yeah. So I think what's really lifting to the surface for me there is this idea of the absence of diversity of thought and the lack of decision making. I think resilience.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And if we look at leadership as a system that you've sort of mentioned, building a leadership system rather than leadership training interventions.
Yeah.
We are, I think, more and more understanding that leadership development really is systemic. You talked about emerging leaders. We actually have in the inspired, sort of universe, inspired leadership universe, we talk about different tiers of the organizations requiring different skills focus, but to create a common thread so that whether it's a graduate program, junior, middle, senior leaders, right through to the C-suite, when we talk about, say, accountability, we are speaking the same language from top to bottom, right? For us, that's what the systemic nature of leadership development looks like.
Yes.
What's your reflection there?
The leader at the top is often the leader, the one person that can influence everything else beneath him. um, have you heard the saying of rotting at the top? So, so my reflection there is, often we don't see the behavior or the direct impact of the leader at the top that is not that has its own that's building its own culture, okay, or the leader at the top that is not living the practiced values of that culture. And often that leadership style is cascaded down, it influences the leaders on the lower levels, and that comes out when leaders at the lower levels use 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 phrases like I was told to do this, or it comes from management, it comes from upper management, it comes from top management. That's when you know there's something wrong in that culture, in that system, in that particular area or that particular pod. So that for me is, I mean, that's one of the biggest problems. And that is often what the data doesn't show you. So you need to be able to read between the lines to see where the gap is at which leadership level, because often the frontline leader takes the brunt, gets the lowest score, but that leader practices what it is shown from the top.
Yeah. Yeah. I always often talk about the weaponization of EXCO,
Yeah.
that people
Mm,
come and they say, this is coming from EXCO. This is from EXCO,
mm,
to almost instill this sense of urgency and fear. And it's like, okay, but if we can't build the product in 2 weeks, you can't promise EXCO that we can build it in 2 weeks. It doesn't matter if it's
yeah.
coming from God Almighty. It's not
Yeah.
possible, right?
Mm,
So I think that speaks to what you're saying, that there is sometimes this disconnect between what people in the EXCO are being told, to be quite honest, and
yeah.
leaders who sometimes haven't the spine to be able to stand for their teams,
Mhm.
and speak truth to power in that way.
Hmm. And often you see that there's leaders who will protect the team from the system and stand up for their team, and then there are leaders who they are just not able to do that because they were told to say what they're saying and do what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think leadership quality we're seeing is not only shaped just by individuals, but by these very systems, by expectations, care, belonging,
Hmm.
development, accountability,
Yeah.
and all of these multiple and multidimensional organizational systems working together.
Hmm.
Is there anything around that interplay between these various systems that resonates with you?
Yes, absolutely. So the first thing that comes to mind is psychological safety on all levels.
Yeah.
If psychological safety is not experienced at the top level, from top to the next level of leadership, it won't be experienced on the floor, on ground level. So psychological safety is also about getting the opinion of everyone else in the room, getting the perspective of everyone else in the room, because sometimes a decision needs to factor in the what actually happens on ground level. So for me, psychological safety is very important. It should be measured. It should be taken into account as part of your culture because that impacts the system. It has quite a big impact on the system itself. And then the other thing that comes to mind is giving everyone a voice. I mean, it ties into psychological safety, but it's not just about trust. It is also about having that voice. It doesn't matter how small that voice is or how wrong that voice may be, but it is about making sure everybody has the voice. I mean, this speaks to retention as well. This speaks to credibility of what people want. And then lastly, I would say is not, we speak about psychological safety, we speak about trust, and we speak about having a voice, but it is actually taking accountability as a leader to take the voice into account and give feedback on that because people want the feedback. People want to know that what they've said has been taken into account. Otherwise, it becomes us and you and the system is broken once it becomes us and you, and us being the ground level consultant or agent, whatever you may call it, the employee on ground level, and leadership on any level.
Yeah, I think you're right. That them versus us bridge is one that leaders need to, I think, be very intentional about
Mhm.
sort of bringing together. And we often think about, as a leader, that diversity, is not just about different ethnicities and that kind of thing, but diversity of
Mhm.
thought is an important part of how we practice
Absolutely.
diversity in the workplace. And sometimes you have to invite the quiet voices in the room. You have to be aware of the dominant personalities, and because sometimes the best ideas come from the quietest people.
Yes,
Um, but they
absolutely.
but they never have that invitation to really come to the fore and participate in the thinking.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And,
So
and diversity of thought and voice also comes from the inexperienced person, the more junior level, because they come in with a different perspective, which could be taken into account.
absolutely. There's a few organizations now I really love. There's a culture, I think, and a growing trend around things like hackathons and just bringing everyone in the organization to think about a particular problem and
Hmm.
every voice being equal in that kind of a
Yeah.
process.
Hmm.
So just shifting gears a little bit, Melissa, what do you think makes leadership particularly difficult in the South African context right now?
Um, it's a lack of trust at institutional level that breeds through to organizational level, and a lack of trust. I mean that makes or trust will make or break a system, whether it is at institution or organizational level. So, I mean, if you think of the generation coming into the workplace now, what do they want? How do you retain them? And those are, I mean, those are the people with that's our future generational leaders,
Mm,
right? What do they want? They want clarity. They want credibility. And yes, of course, they want growth, but we often focus on the growth and forget about clarity and credibility. And in there lies that trust. And at the moment in South Africa, that trust is broken at an institutional level.
yeah. You spoke earlier a lot about the fish rotting from the head down. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's, even in the private sector, you see that people are observing the civic leadership and behavior that is being tolerated and accepted,
Yeah.
that lack of accountability, and saying, okay, well, if this is being permitted at that level, then why can we not, you know, uh, operate the same,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
when you add things like the economic pressure, inequality,
Mm-hmm.
you've talked about the generational shifts that are happening across social, landscapes,
Yes.
burnout, social fatigue. I think people are also just tired, of not being able to hold leaders accountable, but being expected to, pay their taxes,
Yeah.
or
Mm-hmm.
in the workplace to show up where leadership behavior is completely counter to what is being
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
evangelized.
Mm-hmm. And the one thing about what COVID also, well, what COVID brought about was the idea of work life integration, right? And that's where our remote working comes in. But that's also, I mean, that also leads to burnout because remote working sometimes means you don't switch off. It
Mm,
does sometimes mean that the leader expects you to be switched on all the time, not just online, switched on.
mm,
And switched on could be on various communication platforms. There's a Teams message that comes through, and suddenly you're part of a WhatsApp group, and there's emails, and while you have the flexibility of integrating life with work, you can easily burn out
mm.
if there isn't accountability and to the behavior of the leader as well.
You know, when we talk about this always on culture and the effect that it
Mm.
has even on, our brain development, our nervous systems, we never really shut down. We're always in a ready state, fight or flight. And it's heavy, And I think people who lead people, and especially sort of in the sort of HR, human capital, talent management,
Mm.
development, I think, people like yourself, quite frankly, often carry an invisible emotional labor,
Mm.
in the sense that a lot of the weight, emotional weight of the organization rests on your shoulders. and you absorb a lot, and I'm coming
Yes.
to learn and understand. What do you think people really underestimate most about the emotional weight of leadership?
People don't always see the emotional weight. So they admire you for being switched on, for being resilient. But what they don't see is the energy that you've absorbed, the amount of effort it takes for you to make it happen for everybody else. And and what people don't see is the importance of switching off. When you take that break, when you take that annual leave, it is important that you treat it as leave and that you are switched off. And it is important in an organization, and I can tell you that we don't always get it right in this organization, is that people respect your time off, and that if you don't answer, you are not seen as incompetent, incapable, or switched off, or uninterested, but it is just your time to reset, and everybody needs that. And the other thing that is also important, and that I've recently learned, is the notion of once a year annual leave. That needs to be reconsidered in organizations, and especially at the leadership level. Leaders need the permission to take time off, whether it is on a quarterly basis, but take time off more often than just your December break.
Absolutely.
Because by the time it gets to December, what people don't see is the weight of all that emotions and energy that you've absorbed. By the time you get to November, December, you cannot wait for your break. You are already switched off. You're one foot out the door. You're not giving your best self. And all you think about is the date where you actually don't have to switch on your PC or your laptop. And that is often overlooked. It's overlooked that people need to take breaks more often without any judgment, and that people need to reset in their own manner, because the way I reset isn't necessarily the way you reset. Um, and again, and I mean, I often reference to COVID because we've learned so much from that pandemic, and the outcome of it is you should also, in an organization, create the narrative that it is okay to seek help, whether it be on an emotional or mental level. And I mean, people like myself, there's nobody I can speak to at the organization, and often it becomes a very lonely space. So I need to find a way to go and reset, and so that I can show up as my best self when I do come back to the office. And that is not just at the top, that should filter right down to your first line level leadership.
Yeah, that's brilliant, and so true. Some of the work we do around resilience and well-being in leadership is around this very fact of take breaks more regularly. I sometimes ask,
Mhm.
when was the last time you took leave without feeling guilty?
Yeah. Mm.
And it always invokes a chuckle because people always feel in this always on culture. There was a
Yes.
time before these mixed blessing of mobile devices where when you left the office,
Mm.
people literally could not reach you until 8 o'clock the next morning. You were
Yes.
able to leave work at work and be fully at home. And I think we need to find more intentional ways to discover. I mean, I know some organizations actually turn off email servers after 5 o'clock
Mm.
to prevent
Yes.
people, to protect them from themselves in many ways.
Mhm. Mhm.
Okay, no,
But that should be modeled at the top.
absolutely.
Because if it's not modeled at the top, I mean, if your CEO expects you to answer after hours, everybody else will expect you to do that. You're going
Yeah,
to expect that from your team as well.
yeah. That's right. And I think, yeah, it's for many, I think it will be a point to ponder.
Mhm.
So despite the challenges, Melissa, what gives you hope about the future of leadership?
Leaders are realizing that it's not just about managing process and performance. Leaders are taking empathetic leadership more seriously. Previously, I think when you look at emotional intelligence, when you look at empathy, it was always seen as soft skills and it's taboo, right? You cannot take that to a boardroom. Like, what are you talking about? What gives me hope is that in the boardroom, amongst executives, they now see the importance of the person as a whole. It's
Mm.
not just headcount. They see the importance of leading a person along with leading process and performance. And that gives me hope because it does mean that there is now space in leadership development for the so-called soft skills, that it now there's a space, an important space for us to blend it, to blend process management with proper people management.
Mm.
It also shows that organizations are agile and open to the change in the way, um, let's call it the HR department, asks them to lead
Mm.
or guides them on leadership. And that really gives me hope because now it's not just about the seat at the table, it's now about we actually have a voice at the table.
Yeah, that's powerful. I mean, one of the things that we have come to learn, I think, even in our world, is that people talk about soft skills because they compare them with hard skills, but actually, we talk about hard skills and harder skills. It's
Mm,
hard to code. It's harder to listen. It's hard to, build a risk model.
yes.
It's harder to keep your ego in check.
Yes, absolutely.
And
That
so
is
so
so
we
brilliantly
we're
said.
really trying to reframe this idea of soft skills that actually they're essential human skills and they oftentimes are harder skills to acquire. My
Absolutely.
closing question, Melissa, is what is one uncomfortable truth about leadership or organizations that we don't confront honestly enough?
At a Okay. I mean, I can think of two instances. At a very junior level, it is realizing that leadership is now goes beyond a title, and it's the reality of having to make tough decisions. At a more matured level of leadership, what people don't talk about is the isolation
Mm.
that comes with leadership. It's the isolation as I mean, the more senior you become, the more lonely you become. And people don't talk about that because it is seen as weak. I mean, I can use many different words, but it is the notion of having it all together. And sometimes you just don't have it all together as a senior leader. Sometimes you are also just human and you break and you become lonely and isolated and wonder if there's anybody else that you can just reach out to. And that is never spoken about.
Yeah, so true. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Melissa. Thank you for taking the time to enter into this reflective space with me. And to our followers and viewers, thank you very much for joining us on Inspired Conversations. These conversations are an invitation, not just to think about leadership, but to examine how it shows up in practice. And so until next time, lead with clarity and responsibility. Thank you. Cheers.